The train hissed to a stop, and in that cloud of steam, a ghost stepped out. Her name was supposed to be Delia Vaughn, the woman Marshall Merritt Kane had sent for, the woman who was supposed to be his new wife. He stood on that dusty platform in Red Willow, a man waiting for a simple solution to a complicated life. He needed a mother for his two little girls. He needed a wife to quiet the ghosts in his house. He sent a letter, a plain-spoken request for a partner, and he hoped for someone sturdy, someone kind. But the woman who stepped off that train wasn't sturdy. She was a whisper in a pale blue dress, her hat tilted just so, her hand clutching a traveling bag like it was the only thing holding her to this earth. And then, it wasn't enough. Her knees gave out. She didn't just stumble, she collapsed. Merritt was there in a heartbeat, lunging forward, catching her before she hit the rough-hewn planks of the platform. Her body was light, too light, and she crumpled into his arms like a letter read one too many times. The townsfolk stared. They always stared. He carried her to a bench, her head lolling against his shoulder. Her skin was as pale as a fresh-cut bone. He barked for water, and when her eyes fluttered open, they were filled with a terror that had nothing to do with skipping breakfast. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice a fragile thing. I'm not usually like this." He knew right then and there that she was lying. He didn't know what she was lying about, but a man in his line of work learns to read the spaces between words, the fear that hides behind a polite smile. "I'm Marshall Merritt Kane," he said, his voice low. "I believe I'm the man you came for." Her eyes widened, not with relief, but with a sharp, calculated assessment. She was looking at him, really looking at him, trying to see what kind of man he was. The kind who helps, or the kind who hurts? She gave a weak laugh. "I thought you'd be older." He offered a small, tired grin. "And I thought you'd be taller, but I'm glad you're not." It was the right thing to say. A bit of color returned to her cheeks. She was playing a part, and he decided for now to play along. He helped her to his wagon, the silence between them thick with unspoken questions. As they rode out of town, she glanced at the small, whitewashed house on the horizon. "Do you live alone?" she asked, her voice casual. Too casual. A shadow crossed his face. "No," he said, letting the word hang in the air. "I have 2 children, twin girls, Abigail and Ada. They're 6. He watched for her reaction. A flicker of surprise, yes, but something else too. Calculation. He'd left them out of the letter on purpose. It was a test. A woman who would run from the mention of children wasn't the woman he needed. She stared at the road ahead. "Where is their mother?" "She left," he said, the old lie tasting like rust in his mouth. 3 years ago. No one's seen her since." Delia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I wouldn't have turned back, but I'm glad you told me now." He didn't believe her. Not for a second. As they pulled up to the house, 2 little figures burst from the front door. His girls. They stopped dead when they saw the wagon, their faces pale, their eyes wide and old. They weren't just shy. They were afraid. He helped Delia down, and she crouched to meet them, her voice soft as she introduced herself. The girls, Ada and Abigail, just stared. They didn't smile. They didn't speak. They just watched her, these 2 tiny sentinels guarding a house full of secrets. Inside, Delia was shown to a small room. As Merritt closed the door, he saw her reflection in the small mirror on the wall. She wasn't looking at her new room. She was looking at the lock on the door, her expression unreadable. She had come for a marriage of practicality, or so she said. But Merritt knew one thing for sure. This woman wasn't looking for a new start. She was looking for a place to hide. Delia didn't rest. How could she? The small room had a window that faced the woods, and a simple latch on the door that felt flimsy, useless. Every creak of the house was a footstep. Every gust of wind was a whisper. She wasn't just tired. She was a bundle of frayed nerves held together by a cheap blue dress. She stepped out onto the porch later, wearing an apron one of the girls had given her. The child hadn't smiled, just held it out with a solemnity that was deeply unsettling in a 6-year-old. Merritt was splitting wood, the rhythm of the axe a steady, angry heartbeat in the quiet yard. "Need help with supper?" she asked, keeping her voice even. He didn't look up, just split one more log with a clean, final crack. "Only if you can peel a potato without wasting half of it." It was a challenge, a test. She met it head on. "I can peel a potato down to its skin, but I'll need a knife that doesn't wobble." Inside, she found the kitchen was clean but heavy, with a silence that felt older than the house itself. The twin girls wandered in, their bare feet making no sound on the wooden floors. They watched her, their green eyes, Merritt's eyes, missing nothing. "Do you know any stories?" Ada asked, her voice a tiny mouse squeak. Delia didn't look away from the stew she was stirring. A story was a currency, a way to buy trust. "I know a few," she said carefully. "When I was little, my grandpa told me the stars were holes in the sky. He said if you watched long enough, you'd see the face of someone you missed." Abigail, the other twin, looked up from the beans she was snapping. "Have you lost someone?" The question was a sharp little jab. "Yes," Delia said, her throat tight. The girls didn't ask who. They didn't have to. They just seemed to understand loss. It hung in the air of this house like wood smoke. After supper, as she and Merritt washed dishes, their hands brushed in the warm water. A spark of something, a jolt of unexpected warmth, made them both pull back. "You did well tonight," he said, his voice rough. "The girls. They're shy." "They're not shy," she said, her back to him. "They're terrified." He didn't deny it. The silence that followed was a confession. He leaned against the counter, his presence filling the small space. "I was engaged once," she found herself saying, offering a piece of the truth as a kind of peace offering. "He died. After that. I needed to start again. I thought a quiet place would be easier." "You think this place is quiet?" he asked, and there was no humor in his voice. She turned to face him then, drying her hands on a cloth. "Compared to where I've been, this place is a lullaby." And that's when she saw it. A flicker of something in his eyes. He wasn't just a grieving husband looking for a new wife. He was a man standing guard. But what was he guarding against? Later, the girls led her up a rickety ladder to the roof to look at the stars. Merritt stayed below, a silent shadow leaning against the porch post. As Delia sat on the cold shingles, the wind whipping strands of hair across her face, she realized she wasn't just looking at the sky. She was being watched. Not just by Merritt, but by the whole darkened valley. The trees had eyes. The windows of the distant town glimmered like tiny, suspicious pupils. This wasn't a place of peace. It was a place of waiting. When Merritt helped her down from the ladder, his hand lingered on hers for a second too long. His touch wasn't romantic. It was a warning. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm not afraid of deciding," she lied. Back in her room, she didn't undress. She sat on the bed, fully clothed, listening to the house settle. It wasn't just the creaks of old wood she heard. It was the sound of secrets, buried just beneath the floorboards. She had run halfway across the country to escape a nightmare. But as she sat there in the suffocating darkness, she had the terrible feeling that she hadn't escaped at all. She had just walked into a different one. The next morning, Delia woke to the sound of a broom. One of the twins, Abigail, was sweeping the floor with a slow, methodical rhythm, her small face a mask of concentration. Merritt was by the hearth, not cleaning a rifle but sharpening a knife, a long, wicked-looking blade. The domestic scene was all wrong. It was a stage play, and everyone was playing their part a little too perfectly. "You sleep?" he asked, not looking up from the whetstone. "Most of the night," she answered, moving to the stove. She wasn't going to be the fragile, fainting woman anymore. That had been for the train platform, for the audience. Here, in this house, she needed to be something else. She needed to be strong. She made cornbread without asking, her movements sure and steady. Merritt watched her, the rhythmic scrape of the knife on the stone the only sound in the room. He wasn't just watching a woman cook. He was watching an intruder trying to figure out her next move. After breakfast, he went to fix a pasture gate. She followed him. "I didn't come to sit on porches," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. They worked in silence, the damp morning air cold against her skin. He hammered, she held the wood steady. Her hands didn't shake, she wouldn't let them. "Why me?" he asked suddenly, his voice sharp. "Out of all the letters, why choose me?" She had practiced this answer. "Most men wrote about what they owned," she said, meeting his gaze. "You wrote about what you'd lost. I thought we'd understand that about each other." It was a good line. Part of it was even true. But it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that his letter had mentioned he was a marshal in a tiny, remote town, a place no one would think to look for a woman on the run, a place where the law might be flexible. He seemed to accept her answer, but the suspicion in his eyes didn't fade. Later that day, while the girls were down by the creek, Dilea found herself in the barn. Merritt was hoisting a sack of oats, his muscles straining against his shirt. "They've been motherless a long time," he said, his back to her. "I never asked anyone to fill that space." "I don't intend to take something that isn't freely given," she replied. He turned then, his face grim. "They're good girls. I don't always know what they need." "They need to feel safe," she said, and the words were a direct challenge. "Something in this place is scaring them, Merritt. It's scaring them half to death." His jaw tightened. For a second, she thought he was going to deny it, to shut her down. But instead, he looked away, toward the dark woods that bordered his property. "This land. It holds on to things." It was a cryptic warning, and it sent a chill down her spine. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You belong here, if you want to." It wasn't a proposal, it was a plea for an ally. He knew she was strong, he knew she was hiding something, and for some reason he didn't care. He needed her on his side. That night, after the girls were asleep, they stood outside under a sky full of cold, indifferent stars. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing hers. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like signing a contract. An alliance was formed. Two liars, standing together in the dark, surrounded by a silence that was about to be broken. Dilea started seeing things, small things at first, a snapped twig on the path to the creek that she knew hadn't been there before. A shadow in the barn that seemed to move on its own. The girls would stop playing mid-game, their heads cocked, listening to a sound only they could hear. One afternoon, she was sorting through a chest of old linens in her room when her fingers brushed against a false bottom. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Slowly, she lifted the panel. Underneath was a small, leather-bound diary. The handwriting was delicate, feminine. It belonged to Alara, Merritt's wife, the wife who had supposedly just left. Dilea's hands trembled as she opened it. The first few pages were what you'd expect. Notes about the weather, the price of flour, the girl's first words. But then the tone shifted. The entries grew frantic, the handwriting more jagged. "He watches the house. I see him from the window by the old oak. The Marshal of Red Willow can't protect us from the man who owns Red Willow." A name appeared again and again. Judge Silas Blackwood, the town's founder, a man of immense wealth and power. Silas wants this land. He wants the water rights. He told Merritt to sell, but Merritt refused. Now, he looks at me with those cold eyes. He told me a man with a family has so much more to lose. The last entry was short, smeared with what looked like a tear. He was at the house today. Merritt was in town. He didn't touch me. He just stood in the doorway and smiled. He told me Abigail looked just like me. He said it would be a shame if something happened to such a pretty little girl. I have to get them out. I have to run. Dilea slammed the book shut, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Ilara hadn't left her family. She had been running for her life, and Merritt had lied. The quiet, grieving husband was a lie. The whole story was a lie. She felt a cold dread creep up her spine. Had Merritt been in on it? Was he a victim or something far more sinister? Was this house a sanctuary, or was it a cage she had willingly walked into? That evening, a storm rolled in, the sky turning a bruised purple. Merritt came home late, his coat soaked, his face a grim mask. "Bridge washed out," he said, his voice flat. "Had to take the long way back." She didn't believe him. She watched him as he talked to the girls, his hands gentle as he brushed their hair. It was a perfect performance. But she had read the script. She knew the truth, or at least part of it. Later, as the rain lashed against the windows, he found her by the hearth. "I didn't think you'd stay," he said, his voice soft. "I want to," she replied, her own voice sounding foreign to her. She was playing a dangerous game now, pretending to be the woman he wanted, while her mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. He stepped closer. "I'm not an easy man, Dilea." "I'm not asking you to be easy," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Only honest." The word hung in the air between them. Honest? It was a joke, a cruel, bitter joke. He took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. She didn't pull away. She couldn't. She had to keep playing the part until she knew what his role in this nightmare truly was. He thought he had found a partner, an ally. He had no idea that the woman he was holding hands with was now his judge. And the evidence was mounting. The lie about his wife was a chasm between them, and Dilea felt like she was walking a tightrope across it in the dark. She decided to push. Just a little. "The girls miss their mother," she said one morning, her voice deceptively gentle as she packed a lunch for him. "They draw pictures of her." Merritt froze, his back to her. "They don't remember her." "Children remember more than we think," Dilea pressed. "They draw her with a tall, dark man, a shadow." He turned slowly, his face unreadable stone. "They have nightmares. It's nothing." "It's not nothing, Merritt," she said, her voice dropping. "Ada told me his name. She called him Mr. Blackwood." The name hit him like a physical blow. The color drained from his face. For a single, terrifying second, she saw pure, unfiltered rage in his eyes. And then it was gone, locked away behind the marshal's mask. "Stay away from Blackwood," he said, his voice a low growl. "He's not a man to be trifled with." "Is he the reason Ilara left?" "I told you she left," he snapped, his control finally breaking. He snatched the lunch from her hands and stormed out of the house without another word. Dilea's heart was pounding. She had her answer. Merritt was afraid of Judge Blackwood. He wasn't a monster. He was a man trapped in a monster's web. Her fear of him began to curdle into a strange, dangerous kind of pity. That afternoon, she made a decision. She rode the wagon into Red Willow, telling the girls she needed flour. But she wasn't going to the general store. She walked straight up the steps of the largest, most imposing building in town, the office of Judge Silas Blackwood. He was exactly as the diary described. Tall, immaculately dressed, with eyes like chips of ice. He oozed a chilling reptilian charm. "Mrs. Kane," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Though I suppose it is not official yet. A pleasure. What can I do for our marshal's new—" Companion? The word was an insult, meant to put her in her place. I came to introduce myself, Delia said, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to hide their shaking. I believe in being a good neighbor. A commendable trait, Blackwood purred, circling his desk like a shark. But this is a small town, Miss Vaughn. We are not just neighbors. We are a family. We take care of our own, and we do not appreciate outsiders. Stirring up trouble. The threat was clear. He knew she'd been asking questions. As she turned to leave, her eyes fell on a photograph on his wall. It was a group of men, railroad investors, he explained. But in the back, half hidden in the shadows, was a face that made her blood run cold. It was the man who had murdered her fiancé back east. The man who had framed her. The nightmare she had run from wasn't just behind her. It was here. It had followed her, or worse, it had been waiting for her all along. The two horrors of her life, the murder she was framed for and the disappearance of Elara Kane, were somehow connected. And the man connecting them was smiling at her from across the room. She stumbled out of his office, gasping for air. The quiet town of Red Willow suddenly felt like a tomb. She had to get back to the house, to the girls. But as she reached the wagon, a man stepped out from the alleyway. He was tall, dressed in city clothes, and had the hard, confident eyes of a hunter. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat, "my name is Agent Thorne, Pinkerton Detective Agency. I'm looking for a woman, goes by the name of Clara Miller. You wouldn't happen to have seen her, would you?" Delia's real name was Clara Miller. The trap had just sprung. Her world tilted on its axis. The past she had buried was standing right in front of her, tipping its hat. Agent Thorne. Pinkerton. He held up a small, faded photograph. It was her. Clara Miller. "Wanted for questioning," he said, his eyes boring into hers, "in the matter of the murder of one Mr. Alistair Finch." Delia's blood turned to ice. She could feel the stares of the townsfolk. She was exposed, a fraud, a potential killer in their midst. She shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I don't know her." Thorne smiled, a cold, predatory thing. "Funny. You have her eyes. I'll be in town for a few days, staying at the saloon, in case you remember anything." He walked away, leaving her standing in the dust, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. She fled, whipping the mule into a frantic pace, not stopping until she saw the familiar shape of Merritt's house. She burst through the door to find him sitting at the table, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists. The girls were huddled in the corner, their eyes wide with fear. "He was here," Merritt said, his voice flat and dead. "Thorne. He came to the house first." The confession tumbled out of her then, a frantic torrent of words. Her real name, Clara. Her fiancé, Alistair. His business partner, the man in Blackwood's photograph who had killed him over a patent dispute and framed her for it. She told him everything, her voice breaking with the sheer terror of it all. She expected him to throw her out, to turn her over to Thorne. Instead, he just listened, his expression grim. When she was finished, a ragged silence filled the room. "I knew you were running from something," he said finally. "I just didn't know it was that." "You have to believe me," she pleaded. He stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening landscape. "I believe you," he said, and the simple words were like a lifeline. He turned back to her, and for the first time she saw the full weight of the burden he was carrying. "Because Silas Blackwood is capable of anything." And then came his confession. "Elara isn't gone," he said, his voice cracking. "She's alive. I sent her away." Delia stared at him, uncomprehending. "Blackwood tried to kill her," he continued, the words spilling out now. "He ran her carriage off the road. She was injured, but she survived. I knew he wouldn't stop. So I staged her disappearance. I sent her and her brother to a homestead in Oregon. The whole town thinks she abandoned us. It was the only way to keep her and the girls safe. The girls. They knew. The solemn faces, the fear, the nightmares. They were carrying the weight of their mother's secret. "I've been playing a part for 3 years," Merritt said, his voice thick with pain. "The grieving husband, the quiet marshal, all while gathering evidence against Blackwood. But he owns this town. The sheriff, the judge, they're all in his pocket. I couldn't trust anyone." "So you sent for me," she whispered, the pieces clicking into place. "A stranger, an outsider." "I sent for someone strong," he corrected her. "Someone who wasn't afraid. I saw it in your letter. I just didn't know how right I was." The alliance she had suspected was real, but the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. And now, Thorne was here. "He's not a Pinkerton," Merritt said, his eyes hardening. "The Pinkertons have a code. They don't announce themselves like that. He was sent. Blackwood must have learned your real name somehow, put 2 and 2 together. Thorne isn't here to arrest you, Clara. He's here to bury you." A floorboard creaked upstairs. Merritt and Dilea froze. They weren't alone in the house. The girls were downstairs, huddled by the hearth. They were both accounted for. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate scrape from the loft above. Merritt drew his pistol, his movements fluid and silent. He gestured for Dilea, for Clara, to get the girls, to move them to the back room, away from the main living area. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she did as he said, herding the 2 terrified children into the small bedroom and closing the door behind them. "It's the Shadow Man," Ada whispered, her tiny body trembling. Clara held them close, her mind racing. Thorne was a distraction, a performance for the town. The real threat was here, now, inside their walls. Blackwood hadn't waited. He had sent his man to finish the job tonight. She could hear Merritt moving in the main room, his boots silent on the floorboards. Then a voice drifted down from the loft. A lazy, confident drawl. "Marshal," the voice said, "your woman came sniffing around the judge today. He doesn't like that. He doesn't like that one bit." It was Thorne. "You've got no business in my house." Merritt's voice was low, a rumbling threat. "I think I do," Thorne replied. "See, the judge and we have an arrangement. He finds out about loose ends, and I tie them up. Had a loose end back east, a little thing named Clara Miller. Now I find another one out here, a woman named Elara Kane. The judge thinks you know where she is, and he wants her found." A sudden crash from the main room. A lamp overturned, plunging the house into near darkness, the only light coming from the dying embers in the hearth. Clara cracked open the bedroom door. In the flickering firelight, she saw the 2 men. Merritt was crouched behind the overturned table. Thorne stood on the loft ladder, a long-barreled revolver in his hand. "Last chance, Marshal," Thorne said. "Give me the woman, both of them, Elara's location and the new one. The judge will be lenient." "You tell the judge to go to hell," Merritt snarled. Thorne laughed. "Wrong answer." He fired. The shot was deafening in the small house. Splinters exploded from the table Merritt was using as cover. Merritt fired back, his own shot aimed at the ladder. Thorne grunted in pain and surprise, his leg buckling as the bullet tore through the wood and into his calf. He stumbled, but didn't fall. This was her chance. Clara knew she couldn't just hide. She wasn't that person anymore. While Thorne was distracted, she slipped out of the bedroom, grabbing the heavy iron poker from the hearth. "Girls," she whispered back into the room, "when I shout, you run out the back door. Don't stop for anything. Run to the creek. Go." Thorne was trying to get a clear shot at Merritt, leaning awkwardly around the ladder. He didn't see her coming. She moved like a shadow along the wall, her bare feet silent. "Merritt!" she screamed, and as Thorne's head whipped around in her direction, she swung the poker with all her might. It connected with his gun hand with a sickening crunch. The revolver clattered to the floor. Thorne roared in pain, his face contorted with fury. He lunged for her, but Merritt was faster. He burst from behind the table, tackling Thorne and sending them both crashing to the floor. The fight was brutal, a desperate struggle in the firelight. Clara didn't hesitate. She ran to the back door, throwing it open. "Now!" she yelled to the girls. Two small figures darted past her into the rainy darkness. She watched them go, a prayer on her lips, before turning back to the fight. Merritt was strong, but Thorne was a cornered animal, fighting with savage desperation. She saw the glint of steel. Thorne had a knife. He slashed upwards, catching Merritt on the arm. Merritt grunted, his grip loosening. Thorne pushed him off, scrambling for the fallen revolver. Clara looked around frantically. Her eyes landed on the rifle Merritt had been cleaning that morning, still propped against the wall by the hearth. She had never fired a gun in her life. There was no time to learn. She grabbed the heavy rifle, hoisted it to her shoulder, and pointed it at the man who was about to kill the only ally she had in the world. "Get away from him," she said, her voice shaking but loud. Thorne had the revolver. He turned, a triumphant sneer on his face. He aimed the pistol at her. And in that split second, Clara understood something. She wasn't Delia Vaughn, the mail-order bride. She wasn't even Clara Miller, the victim on the run. She was a woman with nothing left to lose, and that made her the most dangerous person in the room. She pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the explosion of the shot echoing the thunder outside. Thorne jerked backward as if punched, a look of utter shock on his face. The revolver fell from his limp fingers. He stared down at the dark, spreading stain on his chest, then looked back at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a gurgle came out. Then he crumpled to the floor and lay still. Silence. The only sounds were the drumming of the rain and Clara's own ragged breathing. Merritt pushed himself up, clutching his bleeding arm, his face a mixture of pain, shock, and something else. Awe. "Are you—" he started. "The girls!" she gasped, pushing the rifle away from her as if it were a snake. "We have to get the girls!" They found them huddled under an overhang by the creek, soaked and shivering but safe. Merritt gathered them up, his strong arms a shield against the storm and the horrors back at the house. Back inside, they barred the door. Clara cleaned and bandaged Merritt's arm while he stared into the fire, his mind clearly miles away. The body of Agent Thorne lay under a sheet in the corner, a grim testament to the night's violence. "He was just the hired help," Merritt said finally, his voice hoarse. "This doesn't end with him. Blackwood sent him. When Thorne doesn't report back, Blackwood will know something went wrong. He'll come himself. Or he'll send the sheriff. It's the same thing." "So what do we do?" Clara asked, her newfound courage starting to fray at the edges. "Do we run?" Merritt shook his head slowly. "I've been running for 3 years, hiding, living a lie. I sent my wife away, let my children think their mother abandoned them, all to avoid this fight. No more." He looked at her, his green eyes burning with a new, hard-edged resolve. "Tonight, you showed me what it means to stand your ground. Now it's my turn." "He owns the town, Merritt," she reminded him. "The law is on his side." "Then we'll use his own law against him," Merritt said, a plan starting to form in his eyes. He stood up, wincing as his arm throbbed. "Thorne was a killer. You shot him in self-defense defending a marshal. That's the story. And we're going to make Blackwood believe it." He walked over to Thorne's body and knelt. He searched the man's pockets, pulling out a wallet. Inside was a wad of cash and a letter from Judge Silas Blackwood. Merritt read it aloud. It was short, brutal, and direct. It instructed Thorne to retrieve information on Ilara's whereabouts from the marshal and to permanently handle the new woman, Clara Miller. It was signed with Blackwood's ostentatious signature. It was the proof they needed, a direct link. "He's arrogant," Merritt breathed. "He never thought this would see the light of day." He'll just deny it, Clara said. He'll say you forged it. Not if the whole town sees it, Merritt said, his eyes gleaming. And not if it's presented alongside Ilara's diary. He looked at her, a desperate, wild hope on his face. We have him. We just need to spring the trap. The plan was insane. It was reckless. It relied on the courage of a town that had been silenced by fear for years. We do this tomorrow, Merritt declared, at the Sunday service, in the church, in front of everyone. We expose him in the house of God. Clara looked at the two little girls, now asleep on a cot by the fire, their faces finally peaceful. She looked at the blood on Merritt's sleeve and the body under the sheet. She had come to this place seeking a quiet life, a place to disappear. Instead, she had found a war. And tomorrow, she and Merritt were going to march right into the heart of it. The church bell tolled, a hollow sound under a gray, washed-out sky. Every farmer, every shopkeeper, every soul in Red Willow was there. They filed into the pews, their faces grim, whispering about the lights and the gunshot at the marshal's place last night. At the front, in the most prominent pew, sat Judge Silas Blackwood. He looked serene, untouchable, a king in his court. He nodded politely as Clara and Merritt walked in, followed by the two girls. He noticed the bandage on Merritt's arm and raised an eyebrow, a silent, mocking question. Clara's hand trembled. In her bag, she clutched Ilara's diary. In his coat pocket, Merritt had the letter. It felt like they were walking to their own execution. The preacher began his sermon, his voice droning on about sin and redemption. Clara could feel Blackwood's eyes on her. He knew Thorne had failed. He was just waiting to see what their next move would be. Merritt waited until the preacher paused for a breath. Then he stood up. "Forgive me, Reverend," Merritt's voice boomed through the silent church. "But there's a different kind of sermon that needs to be given today. A sermon about justice." A collective gasp went through the congregation. Blackwood's serene expression tightened. "For 3 years, I have let this town believe my wife Ilara abandoned me and our children," Merritt continued, his voice ringing with passion. "That was a lie I told to protect her from this man." He pointed a finger directly at Silas Blackwood. The judge stood up, his face a mask of outrage. "Marshal, have you lost your mind? This is blasphemy." "The only blasphemy," Merritt shot back, "is what you have done to this town. You have ruled through fear. You threatened my family. You tried to murder my wife, all for a piece of land." He pulled the letter from his pocket and held it high. "This is a letter you wrote, Judge. A letter to a hired killer named Thorne. An order to murder this woman," he gestured to Clara, "and to find my wife so you could finish the job you started." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "That's absurd. A pathetic forgery. You have no proof." "Don't I?" Clara's voice, though quieter than Merritt's, cut through the air like glass. She stood up, holding the small diary. "This is Ilara Kane's journal. In her own words, she details your threats, your intimidation. She wrote about the day you came to her house and threatened her children." She opened the book and began to read. The entry about Blackwood threatening Abigail. The words fell into the stunned silence of the church, each one a hammer blow against the judge's composure. The women in the pews looked at their own children. The men clenched their fists. "Lies!" Blackwood roared, his face turning purple. "The ravings of a mad woman who abandoned her family." "She's not mad," a voice called out from the back. The church doors swung open. Standing there was a woman, her face pale but resolute. She had dark curly hair and familiar green eyes. Beside her stood a tall, stern-looking man. It was Ilara Kane. The town erupted. Merritt stared, his face a mask of disbelief. He had sent her to Oregon. He hadn't called for her. Ilara walked down the aisle, her eyes locked on Blackwood. "I didn't abandon my family," she said, her voice shaking but strong. "I was driven from my home by this monster. I've been living in hiding, waiting for the day I could return. When my brother heard a Pinkerton was in town asking about Merritt, we knew the time had come." It was a lie, a beautiful, perfect lie they had concocted on the ride over. She hadn't heard about Thorne. She had just decided she was done hiding. Blackwood was cornered. His eyes darted around the church, looking for an ally, but he found only a sea of hostile, accusing faces. The fear he had cultivated for years had finally turned against him. "Sheriff!" he bellowed. "Arrest these people! They're conspiring against me!" The town sheriff, a man who had been in Blackwood's pocket for a decade, hesitated. He looked at Merritt. He looked at the faces of his neighbors. And for the first time, he made a choice. He slowly shook his head. Blackwood's face contorted in a snarl of pure hatred. He reached inside his coat, but Merritt was ready. He drew his pistol in a flash. "Don't even think about it, Silas." The reign of Silas Blackwood was over. He was arrested, tried, and sent away, his empire of fear crumbling to dust. The letter and the diary were undeniable, but the true evidence was the testimony of a town that had finally found its voice. A week later, Elara stood on the porch with Merritt and Clara. The air was clean, the silence was peaceful. "I'm not here to reclaim my place," Elara said softly, looking at Merritt with sad, knowing eyes. "That life is over. I came back to see justice done and to see my girls. My brother and I, we've made a new life in Oregon, a quiet one." She turned to Clara. "They need you. He needs you. You fought for them." Clara watched as the two little girls, Abigail and Ada, hugged their mother, their faces streaked with tears of joy and sorrow. It wasn't a perfect ending. It was a messy, complicated, and real one. After Elara left, promising to write and visit, Merritt and Clara stood on the porch, watching the sunset. The lies were all gone. All that was left was the truth. Two damaged people who had found each other in the middle of a war and had somehow, against all odds, won. "Clara Miller," he said, testing her real name. "It's a good name." "I'm kind of fond of Kane myself," she replied, a small smile touching her lips. He took her hand. This time it wasn't an alliance. It wasn't a contract. It was a beginning. They had faced down their ghosts together, and in doing so had found something they never expected. A home. What do you think? Did Clara do the right thing by running in the first place, or should she have stayed and fought? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of justice in the Old West, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.